Good evening. Whichever way you voted in the great EU referendum, you'll probably agree it seems to be taking an age for us to come up with a clear idea of the kind of exit we actually want. And with that in mind, guess how long it took the other 27 members of the EU to decide on the terms they're going to give us as we get ready to leave? 2 minutes. Yes, in that rather short space of time, they agreed that the so-called transition period will last nearly 2 years. We'll have to keep paying into EU coffers and stick to EU rules, including on immigration. But we won't have a say on any decisions, even if they directly affect us. Our last day in the EU will thus realistically be New Year's Eve 2020, unless they extend it, of course. We can go back and argue over the terms and may well do so, but the general sense from Brussels today seemed to be like it or lump it, and there certainly are bigger fish to fry.
It was Theresa May who asked for this transition period, though in reality having it will make life considerably easier for both sides. But what Brussels is offering Britain today is to all intents and purposes a take-it-or-leave-it offer, which took EU ministers meeting this afternoon just 2 minutes to rubber stamp. For just short of 2 years, Britain will have left the European Union, given up all say in how it is run, but otherwise everything will remain the same. Chief negotiator Michel Barnier spelled out why Brussels is taking such an absolutist line, speaking in English as he does when he wants to make sure the government in London gets the message.
During transition, the UK will continue to take part in the single market, to take part to the customs unions and to all union policies. It will continue to have all the economic benefits. Therefore, it must also apply all the EU rules. The single market cannot be à la carte.
So here's what's on offer: a transition that will last from the moment the UK leaves until the end of 2020. During which time all EU rules and regulations will apply, including freedom of movement, and all enforced by the European Court of Justice. But the UK will have no voice in decision-making and no votes in Brussels or the European Parliament. London will be able to talk trade with other countries, but can't sign anything. Tough as all that sounds, those with long experience of negotiating in Brussels don't see much of an alternative.
Does the UK have any option but to accept the transition that is on offer?
Well, yes, it has an option. It can fall off a cliff edge that it's woefully unprepared for in 14 months, with all of the economic and organisational catastrophe that would entail. But I mean, we know that even the hardest hardliners in the cabinet, at least, if not in the Conservative Party, seem to actually be recognising that reality now.
So you're suggesting that it's take this offer or it's going to be economic disaster?
Ultimately, I think it's a take it or leave it offer, yes.
Michel Barnier has not left an awful lot to negotiate about, but negotiate they will, with the hope being the transition can be agreed in principle by mid-March. James Mates, News at 10, Brussels.
The guidelines on the transition period agreed by the EU today that James was just talking about are, of course, a long way from what Brexiteers and the Conservative Party hoped for when we first voted to leave. So perhaps no wonder that they are worried about how things are going in general and what they perceive as Mrs May's general lack of grip.
Morning, Brexit Secretary. Can the government agree on Brexit?
They arrived this morning to meet a Prime Minister who's always in negotiation.
Is the Prime Minister in control, Home Secretary?
Absolutely, she might say, but talks abroad are sparking talks back home with a party that spent the weekend at war.
Foreign Secretary, are you a swivel-eyed Brexiteer?
If chaos reigns in the Conservatives, it's partly thanks to complete order in Brussels. Contrast EU solidarity with reaction back here to its terms of transition.
Is the government going to reject this new EU ultimatum, including that the EU Court of Justice will continue to apply to the UK?
When is the government going to stand up against the hard Brexiteers who mainly inhabit these benches? There's only about 35 of them. See them off and make sure that we get a sensible Brexit.
It is more likely we get a better offer from the EU if they realise we've got a perfectly good option of just leaving.
The Prime Minister can't escape this story. Earlier she was seen carrying a newspaper in which one MP likens her to a tortoise, as backbenchers call for her to come out of her shell and be bolder at home as well as abroad.
I think the window is closing, but I think she can do it. Politics can be quite brutal if you fail to answer the fundamental challenges of our time around the NHS, defence, housing and so on. You can talk a good game on it, but ultimately if you don't deliver it after a certain period of time, people are going to get a bit tired of it.
I served as a minister under John Major. I was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, and what you saw was the mistake was to kind of stand in the middle of the boxing ring and get hit. You've got to be moving forward.
The noise about the Prime Minister's leadership is nothing new, but the key is to monitor the volume, and over the past week it does seem to have been cranked up, though the vibrations aren't yet loud enough to shake Theresa May from number 10. Especially not when younger MPs remain loyal.
I think that people are getting overexcited and will be very disappointed, the people who are trying to destabilise the party.
Do you not think the window of opportunity is closing for her?
This is not... Excuse me, sorry, can I come out? This is not an issue.
Maybe not until someone else looks ready to take over.
Could you do a better job than the Prime Minister?
Until the answer to that one's yes, their boss can probably survive all the other questions. Paul Brandt, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, in a moment, I'll be chatting to our political editor, Robert Peston, who's just here. But first, let's go back to James Mates in Brussels now. James, transition period, I mean, 2 years in reality, or do you think it'll just go on and on and on?
It may go on a bit longer, but it won't go on and on and on forever. I think the one area where there may be room for Britain to negotiate on this offer is to build in a mechanism to the transition in which it can be extended further down the line if both sides agree to it. Now, London's currently denying that it would even want to do such a thing because, of course, this is very politically sensitive, with some on the Tory backbenches not wanting any transition, let alone one that can go on and get longer still. But the EU are recognising that maybe that hard deadline at the end of 2020, the Bulgarian Deputy Prime Minister standing beside Michel Barnier today said, well, look, if the trade talks aren't going as fast as people think, there needs to be flexibility possibly to extend it. But they can't keep on doing it because there's no legal basis for it. Britain will be in this funny halfway house, and legally that's very difficult for the EU. They can manage it under the treaties for a year or 2 or 3, maybe 4, but it can't go on forever. So, and if there are any Remainers thinking that maybe some future government would be happy to sort of sit in this halfway house of almost being in the EU indefinitely, well, it's not going to happen.
OK, James, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's come back to Robert here. There's an awful lot to talk about today, but I was just reading your latest blog. If you don't follow Robert's blogs, you should. They're very informative. As I came on, and you're talking about this latest economic research that has come out of the Department of Brexit itself, which... Tell us what it says.
Well, that's right. I mean, not only is the Tory party split on whether we should have a transition period when we are effectively signed up to all the obligations of the EU but have no votes, but also on the nature of our future trade relationship. Now, to inform that debate, the government economists, led indeed by the chief economist at the Department for Exiting the EU, have come up with some forecasts about what different versions of trade deals mean for the economy. Now, the terrible thing for the Prime Minister is that all versions of Brexit make the UK poorer. In my blog, I talk about the general thrust, but actually BuzzFeed tonight have actually got the numbers, and they say on all versions of Brexit, as I say, we get poorer. But the really important point is the more that we take back powers to shape business regulations, the poorer we would get. In other words, the version of Brexit wanted by the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, the Agriculture Secretary, the government's own officials are saying their version is the worst possible version in terms of the prosperity of the UK. Now, they will say, this is all a stitch-up by what they call Ramonas in the civil service, but they are the people who are supposed to be guardians of impartiality and, you know, they're supposed to put the national interest first. So they put the Prime Minister in a really difficult position as she comes next week to try and get the Cabinet to take an agreed position on that future trade deal.
Going to be very complicated. OK, but just on what we're supposed to want, any clues as to what we actually want from this whole process?
Well, one of the things that I again reported today, sort of in my earlier blog, is the way that Angela Merkel was poking fun at her last week, the Chancellor of Germany, at the World Economic Forum in Davos. She was asked in a private meeting of senior journalists, well, tell us a bit about your conversations with the Prime Minister. And Angela Merkel said, well, I say to her, what kind of future relationship do you want with the EU? And she says to me, this is Angela Merkel, she says, the Prime Minister says to me, well, make me an offer. At which point I say, I'm the Chancellor again, why should I make you an offer? You're the people who are leaving. And they get caught in this sort of loop where you don't get anywhere. And Angela Merkel, I think possibly understandably, thinks it's about time the British government did tell the rest of the EU what that future relationship that we want would look like.
I think there's a future for you playing both parts. That's all I'm going to say. Right, we will see. Thank you very much, Robert.